It's Veterans Day 2017, and we have visiting with us a guest, Fred Allison, the son of Gene Allison, a former longtime resident of Muleshoe, and also the late Harold Allison. And Fred, you have written a book.
Yes, I wrote a book, or actually I edited a book composed of interviews with a Marine officer who was raised here in Muleshoe, outside of Muleshoe, back in the 1920s and 30s when Muleshoe was not nearly as formidable as it is now. But I ran across him, and as part of my duties as a historian with the U.S. Marine Corps, and I began interviewing him, and it was fascinating. He had a tremendous amount of information about his experiences growing up in Muleshoe, but also about his experiences in World War II as a infantry officer. And I eventually interviewed him for about 50 hours worth of interviews, and I had the interviews transcribed. And then I took the interviews and edited them and sort of rearranged parts of them so that it would be in a chronological order. And the book mostly is about his experiences in World War II, especially at the famous battles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan. And he was wounded at Saipan. But that's basically what the book is about. So it's very interesting. It's a real.
Oh, it is. Now, this is the book, and what's the title?
The title is We Were Going to Win or Die There. So that quote comes from when he was talking about the Battle of Tarawa. One thing that made the Battle of Tarawa unique was there was a reef about a half a mile before the beaches. The Marines were hoping the tide would be high enough for their landing craft to get over that reef, but as it was that morning, it was not high enough, so they had to wade in through 800 yards, about a half a mile of surf before they could ever get to the beach, and all that time they were under fire. So so in talking about the Battle of Tarawa, he said there's no way we were going to go back through that surf, so we were going to win or die there. Uh-huh. And they did die there. So, I mean, they did win. So...
but a lot of them died also.
Yeah, about 1,000 Marines were killed there in a 3-day battle, and
how many wounded?
Probably about 3 times that many were wounded. So it was a tough fight. He was not wounded there. He was wounded in the next battle he participated in at the Battle of Saipan, and he was wounded there by an artillery shell, shrapnel that hit him in the back. And really, that wound lasted with him throughout his life.
And he lived to be how old?
He lived to be 97 years old, so he just died last year. And he had just learned that we had a contract for this book, and he died, unfortunately, 3 days later.
Is that right? So
maybe he was just hanging on to hear if the book was going to be published or not. But he was very loyal to the Marine Corps. He's a diehard Marine. Mm-hmm. He went to after growing up here in Muleshoe. His family had a farm on the Freona Highway, about 4 miles north of here. But in 1936 is when he graduated.
From Muleshoe High School.
Muleshoe High School, right? He met his wife, Melda Chandler, here in Muleshoe, and when he was in junior high, it's a neat story. He was talking about walking across backyards, going to the swimming pool one summer day, and he walks through this one backyard, and there's a girl there he'd never seen before. She was standing on the back porch in a yellow dress, shaking out a tablecloth. Shaking the crumbs out of a tablecloth, and he looked at her and said, "That's for me."
Oh, really?
Yeah, and so they met later in school. They dated all through high school. They sort of parted ways when he went off to college at Texas A&M, and she was doing various things in business school. She had a very interesting life, actually. Before they got married, she eventually earned enough money after high school to buy her own airplane. And she after she learned to fly, she bought her own airplane. And before the war started, she made money by carrying ranchers around, flying over their ranches out by Fort Stockton, Texas, and they would shoot coyotes from her aircraft.
My goodness.
And then when the war came on, she got a contract with the U.S. Army teaching young men who wanted to go into aviation. Gave them some of their early flight instruction before they actually went into the military.
Isn't that something?
That's something, and
especially in that era.
In that area is very unusual for a young woman or any woman actually to be a pilot, and especially to have their own airplane. But she was very unique, and they ended up staying married. They were married for 63 years, and she passed away in 2008.
And he died in 2016.
Yeah, he died in December 2016.
In December.
Yeah, he stayed in the Marine Corps until 1961.
And what was his highest rank?
His highest rank was lieutenant colonel.
And was he ever honored in any way by the Marines?
He was. He first of all he went in the Marine Corps as an enlisted man. With the war coming on in 1940, he went in the Marine Corps. He liked the military. He went in and enlisted, and after about a little over a year, maybe 14, 15 months, he was promoted, or he was commissioned. The Marine Corps had a field commissioning program in the Samoan Islands, and they identified promising enlisted men that might make good officer material, and they would put them through a training course, and those that did well were commissioned. And he was commissioned a second lieutenant there. And most of these men that had been enlisted before went to different battalions than the ones that they had come out of, because you could understand there might be some problems there with your former peers who were enlisted. But they sent him right back to the same unit, to the same platoon he was before, and the platoon sergeant that was over him before now began work for him. And he said there was never any problems. And he stayed in the same unit throughout the whole war. He might have been the only Marine to ever do that. But he really he was really appreciated, and his commanding officer, Henry Crow, who is actually a pretty famous Marine himself, his nickname was Jim Crow. But he liked Roy Elrod and mentored him. And Roy looked up to him, and he moved right on up. He at the Battle of Guadalcanal, Roy got a Silver Star for his combat action, and also was promoted on the spot from second lieutenant to first lieutenant. Mm-hmm. And then that was his first battle. Then they spent a time of rest and recuperation in New Zealand, and then after being there for almost 9 months or so, they went to the Battle of Tarawa, which is a very challenging battle, and he survived that. He was very glad to survive that. A nice thing about doing the research with him and interviewing Roy was that he had a lot of World War II letters that he had written to his family, who were still living. They were still living in Muleshoe, and he gave me access to them. And so you could read, about his experiences from the actual time, as well as him telling about it. And it was he remarked in his letters after Tarawa how lucky he was to be alive. And he also said something about he was writing a letter to his family, and he said, well, I need to end this letter because I got to make sure I make it to church. He said a lot more boys are going to church after Tarawa now.
I bet.
So anyway, but at Saipan he was wounded, and that took him out of the war. It was a fairly serious wound. He was in the various hospitals, eventually ending up in San Diego at the end of the year. That he was wounded in June, early July, actually. So it was almost 5 or 6 months that he was in the hospital, and he still was not recovering. In fact, he still, even when I knew him, when he was in his mid-90s, he still had problems with the wounds that he had
Isn't that
received.
something?
Yeah. But anyway,
Those years.
yeah, and but it was before he was wounded at the Battle of Saipan that he talks about getting back together with Malda. He had heard that she had got a divorce from a man that she had married, and so Roy wrote to his sister asking her to find out if Malda would be interested in getting back together with him. And he wrote that before Saipan. So during the battle at Saipan, on his birthday, he said his Marines came up to him and said, "Hey, we've had a mail call." And they were wishing him happy birthday and everything, too. And they said, "Hey, we had a mail call, and you got a letter." And it was raining. It was a pretty miserable day. So he opened the letter, and it was from his sister telling him that Mally said that she would like to get back together with him. So he said that was the best birthday of his life.
Now, I bet that she had relatives who lived in Muleshoe for years. And who were her relatives?
Her relatives were the Copley family.
Mr. and Ms. A.W. Copley?
I'm not sure.
Yes.
I think so. Okay. And Levon Copley was her daughter.
Yes.
Right?
And so, Don and Doris Jean. There were 3 in that family.
Okay. So, yes. And interestingly, Malda was being raised by her older sister because Malda's and her older sister, both her parents had died. So Malda was more or less an orphan at that time. And so she was taken in by this family when she was maybe 12 or 13 years old, and they raised her.
Now, was that the Copley family?
Yes.
Yeah. So Mrs. Copley would be her sister?
I'm not sure. Yeah, if that's who I'm thinking about. Yeah. Her older sister raised her those latter years when she was in high school.
Okay. Miss A.W. Copley was her sister.
And actually didn't raise her, took her in and then provided for her until she graduated from high school. So, yeah. But anyway, so after he was wounded and he's recovering, Roy ends up in the hospital in San Diego. And in the meantime, he'd been writing to Malda, okay? And never seen her. But he finally gets out of the hospital, and he finds out she's in Galveston. She's working for the Navy then. And drives cross country from San Diego to Galveston to see Malda again. And when he first sees her and they get back together, he asks her to marry him. And she said, "Yeah, but it's going to take a while." And he said, "Well, take all the time. I've got 9 days. Take all the time you want."
So why was it going to take a while?
She just evidently not in a hurry. But he was in a hurry. He only had 9 days to leave, and he had to go back to San Diego because he was still in the Marine Corps.
Yes.
So they did get married at Galveston, and she went back with him, and they were married for 63 years.
Oh, that is wonderful.
So that's the sort of a sidelight. The main part of the book is about his experiences in combat and his memories of combat after all these years. And I don't know if I mentioned this because I'm a historian at the Marine Corps. I've access to all sorts of official documents and reports from these battles. So I was able to more or less fact check his interviews, and he was amazingly accurate. Roy stayed attuned with not only his own past experiences, but with the Marine Corps itself. He loved the Marine Corps and attended many events that they would have, and he was honored at several of them. He was a guest of honor of the Commandant at a Marine Corps birthday ball. Really? A few years before he died.
Did you get to go with him?
I didn't go to that. They also honored him the Marine Corps also has a wreath laying ceremony every year at the Iwo Jima statue there in Washington, D.C., and he got to do that one year, and he asked me to go with him on that.
Oh, how special.
Yeah, so he was did that, and then he was hanging around with all these generals and whatnot. And he was really recognized in that area as a just one of the old iconic sort of Marines from
Old Guard.
too. The old, I was going to say that, the old guard. Yeah. So they very much treasured him and his experiences and what that means for the Marine Corps and Marines today. They reflect back on the experiences of Marines that have gone before, and it really is important. It's really important when they facing tough situations and battles themselves. They reflect back on the Marines of the past, and you don't want to let that legacy down.
No.
So.
And how many years were you in contact with him, and how long did it take you to actually write the book?
Okay, right. We did our first interview on October 12, 2012. So it's almost 5 years to the day that the book was published. And I actually didn't write much of the book. It's mostly first-person accounts in which the transcriptions were, I would, shape the transition. I mean, take out the parts that you would need to tell the story for that part of the chronology. So make it in chronological order. Because you know how people, when they do an interview, they might jump around and talk about one time period and then come back to it later after several other sessions. So I'm shown as the editor on the book.
I see.
And I did the annotations and introductions and footnotes and things like that. But they're his words. They're his words that in which he tells a first-person account of his experiences.
And didn't he join the Marines from right here in Bailey County?
No, he joined in Amarillo.
In Amarillo.
Right, he was in Amarillo when he joined up. And he, now I mentioned he went to Texas A&M. He went to Texas A&M for 2 years. But then he decided that he wanted to, he was very interested in construction. And that's the business he went into after the war and became very successful as a builder and a developer around, in Northern Virginia, especially around the Quantico area. And built commercial buildings, hospitals, schools, churches. And so he became very prosperous doing that. But he realized that he really had a talent for construction and that type of work. In a summer, one of his summers from Texas A&M, he got a job with a builder here in Muleshoe. And the first thing he did was repairing roofs after a hailstorm. Of course, we don't have any hailstorms around here, right? But back in those...
You know that, growing up on the farm.
Yeah, we loved them. But back in those days, everybody had shake cedar. And when they'd have a hailstorm, they'd just tear the roofs up because they were very brittle. But his first job was they would go up in the attic of a home, and there would be another man on the roof. And what Roy would do is have some strands of wire, and he could look through the roof and see where the holes were and just stick a wire through that hole that would tell the guy on the roof that's where a hole was, and they would fix it. So but then he got more into more of the complexities of the building business and really liked it. And the gentleman that was the contractor he worked for, he really liked him, so he kept him on every summer. And then when he should have been going to his third year at Texas A&M, he decided to stay and work because he needed more money so that he wouldn't have to work when he was in school. So he did that. Then he realized that, well, if I'm really going to be good at the building business and all this construction, I need to get a car. So he spent money on a car, and he couldn't go back the next year. And so he laid off school for a couple of years. But one of those during one summer, he went to Texas Tech and took a class there. So you could say he's an alumni at Texas Tech too. Yeah. But that was the summer. He also began seeing in the reels the war in Europe beginning. And he realized that the United States was probably going to be going to war, so he began to investigate getting into the military. And that's when he ran across a recruiter in Amarillo, a Marine recruiter there, and decided to sign up. He sold his car in 3 days, signed up. They didn't sign up there. They put him on a train to Oklahoma City, and he was sworn in there. And then another train took him right back through Amarillo, all the way out to boot camp in San Diego. And that's where that's when he began there, and that was in September 1940.
And so, Fred, now tell me about your career. You started to school, I bet, in Muleshoe, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. I started and finished here.
And what year did you graduate?
I graduated in that very historic year, 1968. A lot of people from that class went on to do great things. So,
well, so did you. Now, where did you go after you graduated from Muleshoe High School?
I went to the University of North Texas, as it's known today. Back in those days, it's known as North Texas State University. And I went there and eventually ended up majoring in secondary education with a primary teaching field of history. I really wanted to major in history, but I couldn't hack the foreign language requirement. I couldn't hack a lot of things in those. I had some trouble at school at first, but I got straightened out, and thanks to God, and so graduated from there in 1965, and I always knew I wanted to fly in the military, because of my dad and my uncles. My dad was a World War II bomber pilot. Oscar, my uncle, was a B-24 gunner, and he was shot down over Austria and was a POW for 15 months. Yes. Then I had another uncle, Wiley Grizzle Jr., who was a fighter pilot, a P-51 fighter pilot with the 8th Air Force, and he was shot down and killed during the war. So these were sort of real role models for me, and I always wanted to. I had another uncle too, George Didlake, who was an airline pilot, and so you grow up with that. And anyway, I saw a recruiter in the student union building in North Texas, and he was a Marine, and he more or less promised me that I could. He'd give me a contract to fly in the Marine Corps. So that sounded pretty good to me. Of course, there's a lot of stuff that goes with that. OCS, you got to go through OCS for 12 weeks, which is like boot camp for officers. Mm-hmm. And then the Marine Corps has a basic school that they send all their officers to teach them how to be infantry officers. Mm-hmm. Every Marine is an infantryman first and foremost. So that gets you in the Marine Corps mindset. And so then I went to flight school. And I became a F-4 radar intercept officer, which is in an F-4 Phantom, it's a two-seat aircraft. One is a pilot and the other is a weapons operator, radar operator, and that's what I was. And I did that in the Marine Corps for about 15 years, and then that airplane went away. So I did other staff work, that kind of stuff. And right at the end of I had 2 years left before I was supposed to retire, and really was looking for a job in the Marine Corps. And I started working on my PhD at that time at Texas Tech. And I heard about the Marine Corps has what they call a field history unit, where you do history work, official history work for the Marine Corps. So I was able to get in that because I was working on my PhD, and then I retired from there. And that was in 1998. And then they had a job come open for an oral historian 2 years later. And I got that. So that was 2000. And we moved up to Virginia then.
And where do you live today?
I live in Fredericksburg, Virginia.
Now, where did Roy Elrod live?
He lived in Fredericksburg, too.
Isn't that something? 2 Muleshoeites in the same town.
Only 2 miles apart, really.
Really?
Yeah. Fredericksburg is actually a big suburb now of Washington, D.C. So there's a few 100,000 people that live around there, but we live within a couple miles of each other.
I'll be.
It was really a unique relationship. And we really identified with each other because we grew up in sort of the same type of environment, the same culture, the same sort of understanding of.
And both on farms, right?
Yeah, yeah. Of course, when he grew up here in the 20s and 30s, there was nothing like back in those days. It was very little development. It was on that.
Yes.
That was on the beginning of when they began to farm the area, converting ranch land because they had the drill technology to tap the Ogallala Aquifer. But really, there were not that many farmers here yet, but it was sort of the time when they began moving in. Mm-hmm. And he was on the his family was on the leading edge of that. But as a boy, he would saddle a horse and could just ride for all day long, just out into open prairie. Picking up arrowheads. There were still buffalo skulls laying around, and just had a very, very unique childhood. But it was almost a frontier town in those days, and he told many interesting stories. He talked about being in town as a young boy when Muleshoe had his last gunfight, and he talks about that and seeing.
Now, is that in your book?
No, unfortunately not.
Well, tell me, do you know how it ended, or did anybody get killed?
Yeah. I'm trying to think of the story. It was two men evidently had some sort of business falling out, and it occurred at the train depot, the old train depot where Griffith's Elevator is there now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it was something about two men in a car and one man on the loading dock, and they had a disagreement. One man got out of the car and shot at the guy on the dock, but missed. And he got back in the car, and the man on the dock shot this guy and then wounded the other guy in the car. But Roy said he was a boy in Western Drug when they brought the man in that had been mortally wounded. Oh. I remember seeing that. And old Doc Matthews was a doctor. You ever heard of him?
I've heard of him. I never knew him.
Yeah, Doc Matthews. But a lot of the stuff about Muleshoe they didn't want in the book because they said the people were going to be interested in World War II, the battles and whatnot. But that in itself would be a very interesting. I still have a lot of that. Yes. That would be very.
Well, you can write another book.
Right. Yeah, that would be a one that would be very interesting.
What were some of the early stories he told you?
Well, the earliest memory that Roy has is him going out with his father and his uncle one day to begin to move into this line camp house that was on the land that was part of the old XIT ranch that his father had bought for the family farm. Unfortunately, when they got out there was a squatter family in the house, and they didn't want to leave. So Roy's father got his Winchester repeater rifle out, and called the family out, and he held them against the side of the house while his uncle went in and loaded up all the furniture of the family, put it in a wagon, and then they hauled it off. And as soon as it was off the property, they threw the furniture out. So they kind of dealt in an old West way with their problems back in those days. So, yeah, that. His father died when he was only very shortly after this event, and so he was raised by a single woman, widowed. His mother was widowed most of the time while he was growing up, and he said that she was a very tough lady. She didn't put up with any nonsense. She was a true blue Methodist, though. He said they never missed the church meeting. And actually, while Roy, I talked earlier about him working for this construction company here, they built the old Methodist church here, and he worked on that. That was
the wooden church that was right on this corner over here of West 2nd and Avenue D. No, E. West Avenue E.
Okay. Yeah, so he helped build that. But yeah, his mother was she's pretty tough. She expected a lot of work out of him. She was also a crack shot with a gun. He said, yeah, he said that when he was 8 years old, he got his first rifle, and she took him outside for his first shooting lesson. She put some bottles on the fence post and said, "Okay, hit those bottles." And so he stood back and he fired and fired, finally hit one, and he was really proud of himself. And so she took the gun away from him, said, "This is the way you're supposed to do it." And she shot the neck off of every one of those bottles without missing one of them.
Oh my goodness!
And so he knew there was a right way and a wrong way to shoot, and she taught him how to line the sights up and whatnot. But she sent him out with 3 or 4 bullets and expected him to bring back the same number of dead animals when he went out hunting. And so he learned to be really a good rifle shot, which really helped him in the Marine Corps.
Well, of course it did. Now, did he have brothers and sisters?
Yes. He had an older sister. Yes, he had an older sister. And then he had, when his mother remarried, when Roy was in high school, he had a stepbrother from that marriage. Yeah.
And, you know, there were Elrods who lived in Muleshoe when I was growing up.
Yeah, it's probably the same family.
Oh, I know it was.
Yeah, they had he had aunts and uncles. There were also the Wallaces, was his mother's maiden name, and they were here for a while. He said his grandfather Wallace, who used to be run an ice house here, was a tremendous influence on him. And he said those old guys really had sort of the old-time pioneering spirit, that they were really very important. Their position was very important, you know, and they very self-reliant, very independent, and they didn't put up with any. They didn't like government interference, and they were all Democrats, but they did not like the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. They might have been, you know, Democrats, but they didn't like those. They didn't like those programs, even though they were intended to help people. So his grandfather Wallace had a real significant influence on him. They weren't afraid to fight. He told him one of the words of wisdom to Roy that his grandfather Wallace imparted was, says, "Don't waste your time arguing with someone. Just hit him." And then if you get into a fight, you don't fight just to knock him down. You fight to kill the son of a bitch. And so that's kind of gives you an impression of what those guys were like, right. The pioneers. And they had to be. Those were tough times. They were tough times.
I can't even imagine.
Yeah, so they were ready. They were ready to fight, but they were also, you might call it the code of the West, the rules of the West. Yeah. You know, when it was appropriate, when it was not appropriate. They were very deferential to women. They most of them were involved with churches and whatnot, and
that was very important. Their spiritual life.
It really was. They had a very close relationship, understanding, fundamental type of understanding of the Bible. Mm-hmm. Conservative, we'd say conservative, evangelical, probably today. But just that old-time religion, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Fred, how can we get the book?
Well, the best way, probably the easiest way, and probably the cheapest way, actually, and I don't know if I should say that, but maybe I should advertise for my publisher. But you can go online, and you can order a book from University of North Texas Press, or Texas A&M Press, because University of North Texas Press is really a sub-organization. It's part of the Texas A&M Consortium of Presses. So either way, or you can go to Amazon and get it. So or to the bookstore. I should have mentioned this. They have them in Barnes & Noble in Lubbock. I don't know of any other bookstores. They might have them, but I know Barnes & Noble have them. There were copies there I saw just last weekend.
And how much?
Well, it's $29 was the last price that I saw. I think that Barnes & Noble had them for. I'm not sure what those prices for books are moving around all the time. So all I can say is just shop around if you want the best deal possible. So.
Well, you're the best deal that I know of on this particular day, Veterans Day, 2017. Thank you for your service, too.
Thank you. I wanted to mention that yesterday is a very important day for Marines. That was the 242nd birthday of the United States Marine Corps.
Really?
November 10th, right.
Wonderful.
Very important.
Yeah, and so are you still working?
Yes, I'm still working. I do still work for the Official Marine Corps History Division, which is in Quantico, Virginia. And my main function is doing oral history interviews still, although I do writing and whatnot too, as I have time.
Did anybody at Muleshoe High School help you tremendously, or in the school system in Muleshoe that you can remember?
Yeah, sure. First of all, my mother, who was this teacher, but she wasn't teaching when I was at school, but she was very much an encouragement to me. But the teachers there, I would have to especially identify Lucille Smith, who was an English teacher there that taught fundamentals of good grammar, writing, whatnot. Very creative.
Lucy Faye Smith.
Yeah, was Lucille not her name?
No.
Okay. Lucy Faye. Well, I know her as Mrs. Smith. Yeah. So her especially comes to mind when you think about writing. She was very important. But other than that, there's a whole plethora of teachers that I could mention, all the way from my first grade teacher, Mrs. Sanders.
Oh, she was a jewel.
She was a jewel, and she got me sort of set off on the right direction. They didn't put up with much foolishness in those days. And Mrs. Costin in junior high, and Coach Washington, and others. Yeah.
Now, did you fight in any war?
Nope, I didn't. I missed them all. I came in.
Lucky.
Well, I was disappointed actually, but we came in right after Vietnam, and then by the time the next war came along, which was the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War in 1991, I was in a reserve F-4 squadron that was in Dallas, and they told us that we were going to be mobilized and sent to the Pacific, so that squadrons there that had the newer aircraft could then go to the war, and we would pick up their contingencies, which was Korea. The Koreans, there was no war going on, but you still got to watch them, you know. No. So we were going to go to the Pacific, and that was supposed to happen within a month. Well, the war was over within a month, so we didn't get to get called up. And then by the time the war on terrorism began in 2001, I'd already retired. Right. So I missed all the fun and games, but just doing what I did in the Marine Corps, flying. That was good training, and it was a great experience.
Well, thank you for your service, Fred, and thank you for this book. This is the book that he has edited. We were going to win or die there. And it's about a Muleshoe High School graduate and a young man who grew up and was born right here in Muleshoe, and Roy Elrod. And Fred Allison, of course, is a Muleshoe High School graduate too, the son of Gene Allison, who now lives in Lubbock. but formerly lived here for many, many years, and he was reared out in the Pleasant Valley community, and the son of Harold Allison, who is now deceased.